Good morning. So Jason gets COVID, and as a result, I end up preaching the sermon before the 2020 presidential election, which means Jason got me much better into this deal. Before we dive in, it felt wrong of me to completely shy away from the thing that's looming largest in our culture right now. So I do feel an obligation to address it. So today we're going to kind of do that. And as Jacob said last week, all of your complaints can go to jason@eastridge.cc. I want you to stay with me this morning. Some of what we're going to talk about may sound uncomfortable. It may sound uncomfortable not because it's truly uncomfortable at its core, but just because we've made it very uncomfortable to talk openly about the political culture, the politics that we're in. So stay with me. I think we'll get somewhere together that will benefit all of us in some way. I want to start, though, with a quick exploration of how we got here. When I say here, I want to tell you what I mean. How did we get to this level of hostility in this culture? This level of animosity, of tribalism, of fear? I think the answer is that we as Christians believe that we were designed in the image of God, and we believe that that design is perfect. But one of the most effective tools of Satan is to convince us to use our design for destructive purposes. And that happens by removing God from the center of it. And as a culture, I believe that we've adopted that approach to a large degree. I want to explain a bit about what I mean. We were designed, as human beings, we were designed with an intrinsic desire to define good and evil, and then to align ourselves with the forces of good. We feel most alive, most complete when we are battling evil on the side of righteousness and good. I believe that we were designed to intrinsically understand that out in the world there are forces at work that are bigger than us. I believe that we were designed to come alive when we feel threatened or when we see injustice or victimization. We were designed to commit ourselves not only to the ideology of good, but to the harbingers of good, those things that we believe bring good into the world. All of this design makes perfect sense in the context of God. When God is the good, and Jesus is the harbinger of that good, all of the qualities that I just described align perfectly. Not only are we happier as people, we're compassionate. We're compassionate with other human beings. We are good for the world. We are not destructive when this design centers around God. When we're aligned with God, we can see that true evil is rooted in the spiritual battle. We see the human beings around us as victims of the influence of evil in this world. We don't view them as the embodiment of evil themselves. Our job, as those who have come to truth, is to show mercy and to show compassion as God has shown us, and to reach the lost, not to attack the lost, not to destroy the lost. Our fight is a spiritual battle. It's not an earthly battle. Our victory comes not by destroying our fellow man, but by reaching and saving our fellow man. These characteristics that I'm describing are built into our genetics. They're built into our DNA because we were designed to join the spiritual battle on the side of good. We were designed to seek God. We were designed to help others do the same. We were designed to be passionate, and when God is our focus, everything aligns. These characteristics are powerful and life-changing. Now, it's been a slow process, but I think over time our culture has weaponized these parts of our design by removing God as the centerpiece. Religion, Christianity, is considered antiquated. Belief in God isn't sophisticated, so it's not culturally relevant. People who grew up in faithful families get to school, or they look around the modern cultural landscape of what's considered valid, and they see that Christianity is no longer viewed culturally as a socially acceptable platform for a belief system. It's mocked. It's considered uneducated superstition, even oppressive. Christianity is painted as outdated thinking, and it's replaced by relativism or by a general commitment to self or to justice, but only justice as defined by the people that I personally agree with. The culture at large has removed God from the center, but we're still left with all of these pesky parts of our design. That's how we got here. I want to tell you what I'm talking about. We still seek to define good and evil. We still have a passion to fight for good. We still feel alive when we're engaged in that fight. We still want to commit ourselves to harbingers of good, to align with entities of good. We still believe that there are forces at work in the world that are bigger than us. But in our culture, there's no God to center these things around, so instead we point them at politics. Now look, politics isn't the only place that we do this, but it's November 1st, and it's going to be a weird week. So this is the one we're going to focus on this morning. Politics is a very easy place to direct these traits. I want to explain what I mean. Listen to the language that we use about opposing political views in this culture. Good and evil is just the start. We use religious language and religious roles to describe our political beliefs today. We define good and evil forces. There are people attached to those movements to serve as its harbinger. One candidate gets placed in the role of God, the other one gets placed in the role of Satan. The ideology is the word. There are saviors to align with each movement, and they have actual names. Antifa, QAnon, BLM, CNN, Fox News, Twitter, and Facebook. They're the harbingers. They're the ones who are going to show us the way and lead us to heaven, which is generally defined as my specific social and political ideology being adopted as the norm. Through the lens that I just described, everyone who agrees with you is committed to the noble fight. And everybody who disagrees is a part of the evil army and they must be destroyed. Through that lens, you're not allowed to see some things you like in multiple political opinions. There's no nuance. That's akin to saying that I disagree with Satan overall, but he had some good ideas. You can't do that. No, true commitment means commitment not only to fighting for our definition of good, but also to destroying evil. And in our culture, the other political side is evil, and it's an all or nothing fight. Lies are things that hurt my side. Truth is defined as anything that helps it. And the things that really hurt my side, well, that's misinformation and propaganda. What's bizarre about what I just described is it actually makes us feel alive. It makes us feel like we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. But it's empty, it's destructive, and it is a total misuse of our amazing, amazing design. You were designed to be passionate. You were designed to seek righteousness, to fight for good, to oppose evil. But you were never designed to point those traits at a political affiliation. But that's where we are. Politics is our societal religion. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Some of you, if you're being honest, are thinking, yeah, that's me. I probably need to check that. Some of you are thinking, yeah, I get what you're saying, but you don't understand. This time, 2020, it's different. It really is good versus evil. That's fine. You don't have to agree with anything I just said. That's my opinion. While others of you, and I'm going to guess most of you within the sound of my voice in this room, and most of you within the sound of my voice online, probably fit into the third category. You're probably thinking, yeah, that sounds right. We've turned our politics into something more akin to religion, and I don't like this. I don't like this culture. I want nothing to do with this insanity. And if they want to destroy each other, fine. Leave me out of it. I'm going to guess most of you probably fit into that category. In the midst of this chaos, in the midst of this cultural moment that we're in, I'm going to assume that many of you this morning are having negative feelings about someone in our culture. Let's just say you have a strong distaste for a certain person or a certain group of people. For some of you, you're struggling with negative feelings about those with differing political views. That's who you've got those negative feelings for. For others of you, you're struggling with negative feelings about the whole thing. To you, the problem is the whole culture, and you want nothing to do with it. Either way, many of us have a distaste for some group of people in this country, but you also have a responsibility to that culture. The good news is that we are not the first ones who've had a strong distaste for a culture while also having a responsibility to that culture. We're going to spend some time this morning in the book of Jonah. If you've got your Bible with you, I'd appreciate you turning to Jonah chapter 3. We're going to look through the entirety of Jonah chapters 3 and 4. But to get you up to speed where we are in chapter 3. The book of Jonah is a book about a prophet of God who's called to minister to a culture that he had no interest in ministering to. Jonah was told by God to go to the city of Nineveh and to preach to the Ninevites, and Jonah didn't like the Ninevites. He had really good reasons. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and they were a merciless and violent pagan culture. Jonah both hated and more than likely feared this culture. They were a polytheistic culture, which inevitably meant that they were a violent culture. Historically speaking, polytheistic cultures are violent. They're built around the idea of multiple gods engaged in conflict. So as a result, people who build a society around that idea are by their nature violent and marked by conflict. Now, we don't use the same terms, and our violence definitely looks different. But as we've moved God out of the center of our culture, we've replaced him with multiple deities who are engaged in conflict. Politics just happens to be the most tangible example of this that we can point to right now. And as a result, we've become a more aggressive society. We're marked by extreme and holy conflict that isn't really holy. And many of us look around and we're disgusted by it. But let's go back to Jonah. Jonah wanted no part of saving Nineveh, so he ran from God. Now, you probably know what happened next. He's tossed overboard from the ship that he's fleeing on. He has himself a little situation with a fish and decides Nineveh's not so bad. I'm going to swing by. Jonah is essentially forced into ministering to a people that he wants nothing to do with. And that point is important for where we're going to pick up this morning. I'm going to begin reading in Jonah chapter 3 in verse 4. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." Shortest sermon ever. There's no warm-up jokes. There's no personal stories. There's no attempt to connect to his audience. There's no, "Hey, let me tell you this crazy story about me and a fish." That's a great illustration. He had it in his pocket and he didn't use it. Nothing. He just says, God's going to destroy you. Good luck with that. That's essentially the entirety of his sermon, but that's exactly what God told him to say. God wanted Nineveh in this situation to hear a very clear and very hard truth. The message in this moment wasn't that they should love each other. This wasn't a grace and mercy sermon. It was that God was fed up and they were being destroyed. We really don't like the uncomfortable truths part of this story. We don't really like the uncomfortable truths part of our calling. Focus your life on God. That's a comfortable message. Pointing all of the God-designed traits that I described in those first few minutes, pointing those God-designed traits towards God, and that leading to happiness, to joy, to completeness, to holiness. We like that message. It's warmer, it's comfortable, and it's a good one, and it needs to be shared with the world. Don't get me wrong. But all of the traits that I listed earlier, point those traits at something other than God. Define righteousness outside of God. Worship something other than God, and you are actively fostering destruction that you will be judged for. That's also a message that we are obligated to share. So what does the Ninevite culture do with the hard truth that Jonah has just preached? We're going to move on to verse 5. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. This is the craziest part of the story to me. It worked. This is every preacher's dream, right? You give this rousing sermon, and the crowd collectively looks at you and says, yeah, we agree, let's totally change. And preachers everywhere read it and go, wait, what? There's a sentence, there was no illustrations. You can't preach without illustrations. That's a preacher joke. If there are preachers in your family, they will laugh at that one. They were saved by a sentence, but not because of the power of Jonah, because of the power of God. Those were God's words. The text goes on in verse 6. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. There is something happening in this verse that I don't want us to miss. The king, along with his people, repents. But to do so, he first has to remove the earthly identifiers of his source of power. He steps off his throne and removes his royal robes. Those robes are the visual representations of a culture's misdirected worship. They are how the world knows who he is. They're how the world knows that he has power. They are how the king has defined himself. The robes are representative of that. For those who recognize their own misdirected worship and who want to direct it back to God, where it belongs, it's going to require you to put down the identity through which you gain earthly power and earthly recognition. You're going to have to take off your partisan robe. You're going to have to put down the various ways that you've chosen to identify yourself that are actively serving as a barrier between you and God. I want to make this as clear as I can. And this is the uncomfortable part, by the way. If your desire to see a particular political party in office has caused you to compromise your Christian conviction, if your desire for a specific political outcome has caused you to ignore clear teachings of the Bible, if your desire for a specific political outcome has caused you to normalize ideas and to compromise in areas that directly defy the teachings of God's Word, if being a Republican or being a Democrat is more precious to you than being a Christian, you need to step off your throne and remove the robes that encompass that identity. The passage goes on in verse 7. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who knows? God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish. The king in this passage is calling for a total focusing of the mind on God. He's calling for a total change, an abandonment of their violent ways, total repentance. And of course they do it. Verse 10, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he'd said he would do to them and did not do it. God honors their changed hearts, and a violent pagan nation is saved. Look, don't get me wrong. I went to VBS too. The fish in the Jonah story is amazing. And it's what we make a lot of construction projects out of for kids. But what just happened is the highlight of this book. What just happened is the highlight of this book. Nineveh appeared to be a nation beyond redemption, but they weren't. There was hope. God heard the cries of a repentant nation and displayed hair-trigger compassion. God's compassion and mercy were offered the second these people asked for it. That's all it took. I think we need this lesson today. I think we need this hope today. Our culture feels lost at times, but I think we get from this passage that we are never beyond the reach of God's compassion. There is hope for a nation in this story, but there's also guidance for Christians in this story. Jonah had a distaste for Nineveh. He wanted nothing to do with this culture, but he had a responsibility to them because he had a responsibility to God. And though he fought it, he fulfilled his responsibility despite his heart problem. Jonah had a heart problem. If he hadn't had a heart problem, there would have been a chapter 3, verse 11 right here at this spot in the text, and it would have read something like this. upon seeing God change the heart of an entire nation, Jonah returned to his homeland, sharing the amazing story and workshopping his 7-part leadership training series entitled Saving Nineveh. But that's not what happened. There is no verse 11. There is a chapter 4, though. And in that chapter 4, Jonah's not praising God for all the amazing things that just happened. He's angry. He's bitter with God for showing mercy on people he didn't believe deserved it. In the first few verses of chapter 4, Jonah tells God, see, I knew you were going to do this. I knew you were going to be all compassionate with these awful people. He's so upset by God's grace being offered to people that he doesn't feel deserve it, that he literally says to God, just kill me. Jonah wanted people punished. He didn't want them saved. For those of you who are fed up with this culture, I understand. For those of you who want no part of what you see going on around you, what do you desire for those people in your heart? I think if we're being honest, a lot of us would say, I don't care. Eat each other alive. Destroy each other just so I don't have to listen to it anymore. That's what Jonah wanted too. It's very human, but that's not what we need to be rooting for. We need to pray, not for judgment, but that people would be shown God's grace in spite of their sin. Jonah wanted mercy for himself. We saw that in the first 2 chapters. But he didn't want grace for these people. To me, this reminds us that anger is not our job. Vengeance is not our job. Jonah is mad because God saved people he hated. God reminds him of his place, and he reminds him who's in control. Then Jonah pouts, and he goes out and he finds a spot overlooking the city. He wants to see what's going to happen next. My guess is he's probably hoping that God changes his mind and rains down punishment anyway. I imagine him sitting there pointing at the city and saying, do the thing, do the smiting, smite. Fire, hail, rabid coyotes, whatever works, just make sure they're punished. God allows Jonah to stew in his anger, and over the course of the next 3 verses, God gives Jonah shade in the form of a plant. It grows over him to protect him from the elements while he pouts. And then the next day, God takes that plant away. Jonah's miserable again, and God asks Jonah if he pities the plant. Jonah says yes, to the point of death. Jonah's a little dramatic. But let's pick up in verse 10 and see how this exchange ended. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle. Here's the craziest part of this story to me. This is where it ends. The book of Jonah is done right there. Those are the last words in the book of Jonah. These words, directly from the mouth of God, are the final words in a saga that's involved storms and fish and near-death experiences and a mass conversion. So I think they're kind of important. So what is that message? And what's that message for us today? You, righteous person. You, believer. You, follower of God. You show pity on trivial things. You show pity on things as trivial and out of your hands as plants, but you want punishment and judgment for people you don't like. I hear God saying to Jonah, you may hate these people. You may despise everything about their culture, but I made them. They're mine too. I have compassion for them, and so should you. I'm going to end with this. It's going to be a weird week. I don't know what to expect. I know you don't either. But let's ask a couple of questions hypothetically for just a second. How would this week look different if instead of viewing our political opponents as the literal embodiment of evil, we viewed them as human beings and treated them with compassion? How would this week look different if we, as believers across this country, tried to turn hearts back to God with the same fervor that we try to turn them towards our particular political affiliation. I know the numbers aren't as high as they were 20 years ago, but you realize 65% of the people in this country still identify as Christian. That's over 213 million people in this country who still call themselves Christians. How different would our political dialogue, our political landscape, and even our political agendas, how different would they look if those 213 million people tried as hard to bring people to Christ as they do to bring them to their social ideology? What if we were willing to speak harder truths? To show compassion on people we don't like. To put God back in the center of our motivation. To be as passionate about our calling to God as we are about our political affiliation, and to care less about social constructs than we do about souls. 213 million people in this country. Jonah was one guy. I want to say this as clearly as I can. I know tensions are high. I know passions are high. But please remember this week, you were not called to a political affiliation. You were called to the body of Christ. You can have your political affiliation, but don't put it where God should be. And I know some of you are worried that this country is too far gone. You worry that there's no going back. You feel that way because you may not realize it, but you're kind of buying the lie that Christianity is outdated. It's not, which means we're absolutely not too far gone. God had compassion on a sinful and pagan nation when he had compassion on Nineveh. His compassion was a hair-trigger compassion. Our prayer today is that he shows that same compassion for the United States of America. Anytime we gather together, we want to give an opportunity for those who may have a spiritual need that needs to be met. We want to give an opportunity for that need to be recognized and for us to do what we can to meet that spiritual need. Maybe you'd like our prayers. Maybe you'd like to take this morning to put your Lord on in baptism. Either way, if you have a spiritual need that we can address, we'd be honored to do so. You can make that need public by coming forward. We'll meet you as you do, as we stand and as we sing.